I do want to talk a little bit about, because we've used this word a number of times, and I know that you have a very well-informed and unique perspective on this particular word. I want you to kind of define or talk a little bit about evidence for me, because I think that that gets a little bit murky. We've used the word a number of times when someone's saying, I want evidence that Christianity is true, or I want evidence that God exists. They're thinking about some of those things, and that's why we have this whole problem of divine hiddenness, or this hide and seek game, is because what they're thinking of evidence, or what they're looking for as evidence, may not necessarily be what I'm defining as evidence, or what you're defining as evidence. So just give us kind of a broad understanding of evidence as you see it.
Sure. So I'm a Bayesian, and before your listeners freak out, let me uh, explain what I mean by evidence as a Bayesian. So for a Bayesian, evidence is defined in terms of a likelihood ratio, which
Okay.
measures attempts to quantify the strength of a particular piece of evidence. So the likelihood ratio is the probability of that particular evidence given your hypothesis on the numerator, and the probability of that same evidence given the falsehood of the hypothesis, and that would be the denominator. So to the extent that that likelihood ratio is top heavy, that is how strong your evidence is. So for example, if you have a likelihood ratio of 5 to 1, which is known as a Bayes factor of 5, then that means that your evidence is 5 times more likely if your hypothesis is true than if it were false. And if you have two pieces of evidence of the same evidential value, then that would be 5 times 5. So the cumulative power of these two evidences taken together would be 25, and
Okay.
so forth.
So maybe you could give us like an example from the New Testament. So if I'm understanding you correct, and please correct me where I'm not getting this right. Bless you. So something like the stories of a resurrected Jesus, right? So we have clear indication from just reading it historically, not reading it as a divine document, historically, that Jesus lived and that he was crucified. But then we do have some testimony, some writings from as close as we can get to the actual event that people witnessed Jesus afterwards. So are you saying that the likelihood of those existing afterwards raises the probability of Jesus actually walking out of the grave, or are you saying something else? How would you evaluate some of those?
No, absolutely. The probability of the apostolic testimony to have encountered the risen Jesus alive from the dead is more probable given the resurrection hypothesis than given the falsehood of the resurrection hypothesis, which in turn raises the probability of the resurrection hypothesis actually being true. And I think that's especially the case when we consider the nature of the claimed resurrection encounters with Jesus. In fact, I would argue, and I think one can argue very robustly and in a compelling way, that the Gospels and Acts are based on substantially reliable eyewitness testimony. That is, they're written by authors who are close up to the facts, they're well informed, and they're habitually reliable. And I think there's a very fantastically powerful cumulative argument to be made for that. That being the case, then the if that is the case, then we have to take seriously what those documents say concerning the nature and variety of the post-resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus, including its multi-sensory or polymodal character involving not just sight, but group sightings, physical contact with Jesus,
Right.
group conversations with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And according to Acts 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period. So it wasn't just a brief and confusing episode. And so that sort of experience is something which is very difficult to be honestly mistaken about, and so it reduces, I think, quite significantly the plausibility that the apostles were honest and mistaken. And then we can look at the circumstances of the testimonial claims made in the Gospels. For the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Christian Church, including in the first century, the Christian movement was persecuted by the Roman Empire, albeit in waves, but certainly the apostles uncontestably endured labors and dangers and toils and hardships as a result of their testimony that Christ has been raised from the dead. And so their willingness to suffer persecution and hardships is significantly more probable given the hypothesis of sincerity than the falsehood of that. And that's just the peak of the iceberg. But as you reduce the probability of the hypothesis that they were honestly mistaken and the hypothesis that they were deliberately deceiving people, you redistribute the probabilities, because when anyone makes a testimonial claim, there are 3 and only 3 categories of explanation which could purport to explain that claim. One is that they lied about it. One is that they're honestly mistaken. One is that they're true. That what they're saying is true.
Yeah.
And so as you reduce the probabilities of the first and second hypothesis, you redistribute the probabilities such that the third hypothesis increases in probability. So that's my approach to making the case for the resurrection.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that clip of the conversation that I had with Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. If you want to watch the entire conversation I had with Dr. McLatchie, you can go ahead and click here. As always, if you are dealing with deconstruction, I would invite you to subscribe. Thanks. We'll see you next time on Dealing with Deconstruction.